Can everyone hear me okay? I guess, can anyone not hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks everyone so much for coming. I know that a lot of you have seen this or a similar training before. So I really appreciate you coming anyway. And I'm gonna try and make it as interactive as possible so that for those of you who are new, you'll learn a lot, and those of you who are not new might also learn something. Yeah, so I'm Grace. I'm the coordinator for the Cayuga Lake HABs monitoring program. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about our program. This photo was taken by one of our HABs harriers. I saw a few of you, heard a few of you getting excited about that. So thank you, Holly, for the photo. Yeah, now let's get started. Let's see. There we go. So for those of you who don't know, Community Science is a local nonprofit organization focused on water quality in the Finger Lakes. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit and a state certified water testing lab. And so that means that our data are regulatory quality, and that means our results will hold up in court. And it also means that we follow really specific lab protocols and procedures. And we'll get into some of that and some of the particulars of collecting samples. That'll be relevant to some of the ways that we're being trained today. And so some of the rules that I'll talk about later, some of those are in play because it helps our results stay certified. So we also have 4 volunteer water monitoring programs. Much of the data that we analyze in our state certified water testing lab comes from those different programs. And those programs are our synoptic stream and lake monitoring program, in which a group of volunteers take samples from all along a creek on the same day. And then they send those samples to CSI's lab where we analyze them. We have the Cayuga Lake HABs monitoring program, which of course we'll talk about much more for the rest of the this meeting. And then we have our biomonitoring program. In this program, volunteers collect organisms from streams to learn about water quality. And then in our red flag monthly stream monitoring program, our volunteers test water chemistry next to the stream. And then once we have all those results, we store them in our free public online water quality database that we'll also talk about a little bit more today. And on there, anyone can look at them and learn from them without our goal with that is to prevent any barriers to entry. And then finally, we have some outreach and education programs that we do with our community, things like free children's programming that we have in the summer, or sometimes we'll do talks in other locations. So yeah, and of course, today we're focusing on the harmful algal bloom monitoring program. And so I'm going to talk today, this is going to be kind of like a 3-part training. So we'll start, part 1 is going to be what is a harmful algal bloom, for those of you who don't know. We'll talk about what harmful algal blooms are made of and kind of some of the impacts, why we care about them, why we're monitoring them. Then we'll talk about identifying HABs. We'll see a presentation by the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation. Many of you may already be familiar with it, but it's a really good way to get a general sense of what is and is not HABs. And then I will put together, we're going to have a little bit of an interactive identification lightning round after we watch that video, just to kind of get all of you in practice. And then finally, we'll talk about reporting HABs, and that will be what the Cayuga Lake HABs monitoring program looks like, as well as volunteer duties. And I should say, I meant to change this. I wrote CSI's Cayuga Lake HABs monitoring program, but we of course do this in partnership with 2 other organizations, Discover Cayuga Lake and the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network, who we have Liz here with us, their executive director today, and she'll finish off the training by talking about lake-friendly living, which is a program that the network is a part of. So we love partnering with them, and we're very excited that she's here with us. So yeah, let's talk about HABs. So there are an enormous range of phenomena that are considered harmful algal blooms that kind of fall under this umbrella. And some that you honestly hear much more about, that there's actually more attention given to, from what I've seen in scientific publications and globally, is these marine harmful algal blooms, which you might have heard referred to as red tides. These are a huge problem. But they are not what we're referring to when we see harmful algal blooms on Cayuga Lake. They're made up of dinoflagellates and of diatoms. Now, I'm wondering, can anyone tell me what freshwater harmful algal blooms are made of? You can just unmute and yell it out.
Cyanobacteria.
Bacteria. Cyanobacteria.
That's right. Yeah, good. Okay, everyone knows. Yes, they are made up of cyanobacteria. So in a freshwater ecosystem like Cayuga Lake, what we see and call a harmful algal bloom is actually not made up of algae at all. Cyanobacteria can sometimes be referred to as blue-green algae, but they're a different organism than algae, technically speaking, scientifically speaking. So we'll still call them HABs because that's how they're basically known. But just it's important to know, especially as a HABs harrier or a volunteer, that harmful algal blooms are in fact made up of cyanobacteria. So what are cyanobacteria? Before we can really talk about HABs, I want to just take a couple of minutes and talk about cyanobacteria on their own, the things that make up HABs, because they're actually fascinating organisms in and of themselves. They're super important in the history of life on Earth, and they existed for a long time before we ever started thinking about HABs and before humans existed, and actually before dinosaurs even existed. So let's talk about where they come from just really briefly. 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was formed. About 3.8 billion years ago, we saw the first life on Earth. And at this point in Earth's history, there was no oxygen on Earth in the atmosphere. Instead, most of the gas in the atmosphere was actually methane. And at this point, because there's no oxygen, all the life on Earth is anaerobic, which means that it doesn't need oxygen to survive. Does anyone have any guesses about when approximately cyanobacteria evolved for the first time? If you're shy, you can put it in the chat.
About 3.5 billion years ago.
Yeah, that's one estimate. The estimate that I've found says 2.7 billion years ago, but there's many estimates. So I'll give you 3.5. So cyanobacteria evolve, and they are the first organisms in Earth's history that did photosynthesis. So they're the first organisms that were able to generate energy from sunlight, and they importantly also, by doing so, a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen. And so when cyanobacteria evolved and started producing oxygen as a byproduct of the way that they make energy, photosynthesis, they prompted this event called the Great Oxidation event. And during this period of time, from about 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, because of cyanobacteria, the oxygen levels in the water where cyanobacteria were living, and then by extension in the atmosphere outside of the water, the oxygen levels slowly start to rise and gradually replace the methane until it paves the way for life as we know it, that largely depends on oxygen. And interestingly, cyanobacteria ultimately evolved into organelles. So they still exist independently, but they were absorbed into plant cells and created these organelles called chloroplasts that are the way that plants are able to do photosynthesis. So I just think that that's a really interesting piece of cyanobacteria. And then importantly, or interestingly, just to give you some context for the way that, for how old and how long cyanobacteria have been around, insects evolved about 480 million years ago, dinosaurs evolved about 200 million years ago, and humans only evolved about 250,000 years ago. So cyanobacteria have been around for longer than most of the life that we are familiar with on Earth, or that we think of as really common on Earth. And so cyanobacteria they have a long evolutionary history, and they've played an important role in the environment. And they're not always necessarily a bad thing. They can be a part of a healthy, balanced, and normal freshwater ecosystem. And they still do coexist in the water with other microorganisms, even when there are no visible blooms present. And so this water droplet kind of represents a healthy balance in a freshwater ecosystem where there is a little bit of cyanobacteria, but there are also a lot of other microorganisms alongside it. And they start to become harmful when, instead of seeing them as a small portion of the microorganisms that are present, when we look at a single droplet of water under a microscope, we see exclusively or almost exclusively cyanobacteria present. Harmful algal bloom is this explosive population growth of cyanobacteria, and that's when the toxins that they can produce can start to reach dangerous levels. So cyanobacteria produce a lot of different compounds, not just toxins. Not all of them are negative. They've actually been used in a lot of pharmaceuticals, and some of these compounds can actually be extremely beneficial to humans, and some of them are still being researched for their additional benefits. A lot of them are not well understood yet, and they're also being studied. And then, of course, there's the cyanotoxins, which we know about, and those are the reason why we get concerned about harmful algal blooms. These are often liver toxins or neurotoxins, and these are the main reason why we get concerned about HABs. These are the things that have negative impacts on the things we value and the ways that we like to interact with water. So making contact with blooms can be dangerous because of these cyanotoxins. Many of the compounds they produce, they can cause skin irritation by making contact with it, liver and neurotoxins, as we talked about before. And so that can make it harder for us to swim in the water, or make it more dangerous for us to swim in the water. They can impact drinking water sources. They can hurt people's pets if pets get into a body of water that has a harmful algal bloom in it. And then they can also impact humans more indirectly through economic impact. So they can impact real estate prices. They can impact tourism dollars, especially in a beautiful place like the Finger Lakes, where a lot of the economy that exists in this area is dependent on tourism dollars. So those are also impacts that harmful algal blooms can have. And then finally, they can have a lot of impacts on the lake's ecology. They can lead to conditions that don't have oxygen, called anoxic conditions, by throwing the ecosystem out of balance, and then that can lead to the death of fish and other organisms. And then there's also toxins that they produce that can have specific impacts on individual species. So there's a lot of different factors that can go into the generation of a harmful algal bloom, and they're very complex and they interact with each other. So it's hard to pinpoint any one cause, but these are some of the things that are thought and that there's evidence contribute to harmful algal blooms. So one thing is sunlight, which kind of makes sense because they're photosynthetic organisms. So they use sunlight for energy. And so when there's more sunlight, they're able to generate more energy and reproduce. Another thing that we've noticed, and that's reflected in some investigations into harmful algal blooms, is when there's more wind, there's less likely to be a harmful algal bloom. And so on the flip side, when there's less wind, when it's more of a still condition on the lake, we're less likely to see we're more likely to see a harmful algal bloom. Increased temperatures in both water and air, but especially water, are thought to contribute to the formation of harmful algal blooms. And then finally, we have nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which can be a factor in forming harmful algal blooms. And these can come from a lot of different places. You know, we often think of them as coming from agricultural runoff, but there's other places they can come from too. Like wastewater, urban runoff, industrial runoff, and even complex interactions inside of the lake that have to do with nutrient cycling internally. So in summary, a harmful algal bloom, the H is for harmful. That's because of the toxins, the economic impacts, they have aesthetic impacts, and the ecological damage that they cause. A stands for algal, which is a misnomer because HABs on freshwater at least are actually made of cyanobacteria and not true algae. And then this B that stands for bloom, that talks about this proliferation of cells. So that's where that refers to these dense concentrations of cyanobacteria that come about. So now, now we'll pivot from what is a harmful algal bloom into identifying HABs. And I'm hoping that this video will work, and if it doesn't, I have. Oh, I'm so sorry. Some people aren't hearing sound, is that right? Is everybody not hearing sound? Okay, let's see.
You're back on. Thanks for coming back.
You can hear me, but not the video?
No, I've got both. I've got the video and your voice now, but you were silent for 20 or 30 seconds.
Okay.
No sound.
No
I
sound.
can't hear the sound either.
Okay, let me, I'm gonna close out of this presentation, sorry, and see if I can pull this up just on my screen. So I'll stop. Well, no, I want to keep sharing. Okay. Still recording. Yes, I am. Thanks everyone for your patience. Okay, I think I must have not been sharing the sound. So let's see.
Now we're going to transition to identification. First, we'll start with things that are not HABs. These are the three categories that are most commonly suggested that people think they're HABs, and we have to explain they're not. Filamentous green algae, duckweed or watermeal, floating aquatic plants, or pollen. And we'll go through pictures of all three. There are many different kinds of filamentous green algae, and the best rule of thumb for identifying that is if it looks like you could go out and scoop it up with a pitchfork, or if it's bubbling or silky or foamy, or not foamy, bubbly. I said that already, didn't I? Anyway, if it looks like something you could grab out of the water, it's probably not a cyanobacteria HAB, because remember, we're talking about microscopic cells. Those don't have any structure, they don't hold together, and filamentous green algae often does. This is a type that usually forms on the bottom of ponded water, and again, you can touch it and stretch it, and cyanobacteria will never form strings like that. Duckweed from a distance can look quite a bit like a harmful algal bloom. It has that same neon green color, but it's just, they're floating. They're some of the smallest vascular plants, and they're floating on the surface. And if you look at them closely, you can see the individual leaves. This is not microscopic. These are macroscopic individual plants that you can see. If you look closely, they actually have a little root on the underside. So they're very different than algae or bacteria. And again, they're often mistaken for a HAB. Pollen is also one that we get calls about every year, and we can diagnose it pretty easily because it's usually in June. And we don't have very many harmful algal blooms in June, but pine pollen in particular is common at that time of year. It's usually very bright yellow and will form a surface scum like that, but it breaks up very easily, and it's just a matter of a few weeks. So now we'll switch to things that are harmful algal blooms. Unfortunately, harmful algal blooms can have a whole variety of appearances. There's not one quick rule. They can be green, blue, white, brown, They can either be mixed into the entire water column or just floating on the surface. They can be impossible to see any distinction, or they can form little clumps. So there's a lot of different characteristics, but I'll show you a bunch of pictures and then you'll know. So they can look sometimes oily or like spilled paint. That blue color is pretty diagnostic, but some people mistake it for petroleum products. But in this case, it's blue and green mixed together. Sometimes it's a bit more dull, like a pea soup, light green color. Again, really mixed into the water there. Here, this shows how it's really just right on the surface. So you can see here, it's just really the top layer of the water that it's floating. And here, some logs are actually trapping some water, and that's pretty common. Anywhere where there's reduced flow and mixing is where it can accumulate and float up and be trapped. But on a bigger water body or in windy conditions, you can see it completely mixed into the water, where it's just solidly green water, which is a different scenario. Sometimes when it floats up to the surface, it can form actually like linear lines on the surface of the water, even parallel lines or swirly windrow type formations. So this is just an example of that. And then other like docks, pylons, other materials on shore will cause it to get trapped and accumulate. And this is a scenario where it's sort of dying and decaying, so it turns that browner, white, blue color. And here the cells are probably dying and releasing what's inside of them, so these types of blooms can actually be much more toxic than those out in the open water with healthier cells. So here you can see how it's, you know, accumulating right on the shoreline where you might be recreating, but out in the open water it's quite blue and maybe not an issue. So this plays a role in, again, how we talk to the public about it, because, you know, we can never close a water body. That is not a function of state government. We can only close beaches, regulated swimming areas. But we can advise people, you don't want to, maybe don't swim where it's green, but if you go out on your boat to the open water and it looks blue and clear, there's a low likelihood that you'll encounter health effects out where you don't see green water. So just because there's a HAB in one place on shore doesn't mean the entire water body is impacted, and certainly doesn't mean it's off limits. Sometimes, particularly in calm water conditions, it can form sort of clumps, but these are not solid. Like, you can't pick them up. If you poke these with a paddle or something, they'll just break into pieces. There's no substance to them, but it is kind of a characteristic of HABs, again, floating up to the surface. All right, pop quiz.
Okay, so now we're gonna pause and I'm gonna give you a different pop quiz since a lot of you have seen that already. Okay.
Suggested that people think they're HABs.
There we go. Okay, is this a HAB? Ooh, let me see if I can do a poll. Be fun. No, I don't know how to do that, so I'm going to need all of you to just just jump in. Do you think this is a HAB? Yes or no?
Yes.
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 Very good. Yes, this is a HAB. How about this one? Let's hear from someone who hasn't been a Harrier in previous years.
No.
That's correct. Yeah, this is not a HAB. So this is murky water, but it doesn't have that green tinge to it that'll really give away that it's a HAB. Thank you, Michelle. How about this one?
Say yes.
Could be.
Yes, this one is a HAB. And how can you tell?
The white blobs.
Sure. Yeah. And you can see kind of there's this greenish tinge, and it's pretty well dispersed. It doesn't look like it's I suppose down here in the bottom, can you guys see my mouse?
Yes.
In the bottom, it looks like potentially it could be algae, but I know it's a HAB because this is something that someone reported and collected. And so when we looked at it, we saw cyanobacteria in it. and
Oily looking. It's a little oily looking.
it's a little oily looking too. Yeah, good call. Yeah. How about this one?
No.
No.
Yes, you're right. Yes, no. Correct, but it's no. This one's not a HAB, and how can you tell?
It looks like you can pick it up.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Okay. How about this? How about this?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Definitely.
This one is, and you can.
This one is, and you can pull the
parallels.
parallels.
How about this one?
How about this one?
Good call. Good call.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I can't tell. I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, this one is.
Sorry, could we have everyone mute?
We have everyone mute.
Just on your side. Sorry. Echoes now that are making it harder to hear. Thank you. So this one I threw in because this one's kind of an in-between. And so this is another one that one of our volunteers collected. This one could kind of go either way, you know, and that's where when you're a harmful algal bloom harrier, there's going to be some times when you have to use your judgment, and it's not always going to be clear cut. You know, we're trying to collect really hard data, and science likes to put things in boxes, and we do our best to do that, but there's also going to be some gray areas, and we're not going to be able to capture everything in exactly the way that we're seeing it. We're just doing the best that we can to understand it and approximate that. And so someone did bring this bloom in, and we saw a tiny, tiny little bit of cyanobacteria in it, but very little chlorophyll A, and very little microcystin toxin. And we'll get into some of those metrics a little bit later, but yeah, this one, it was interesting to hear everybody. We had some different answers, some yeses and some nos, and that's because it's kind of in between. How about this one?
Oh.
No.
No.
That's right. Yeah, this is not a bloom. And this one?
Oh, no.
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 Also no. Yes. Okay, good job, everybody. You're all officially trained, you're all ready. Now we'll talk about kind of what your duties are as harriers. Thanks for playing my game with me. Let's see. Oh dear, I'm still recording, aren't I? Good, I am. Okay. So the Cayuga Lake HABs monitoring program started in 2018 in response to broad concern in this area about harmful algal blooms. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a partnership between Community Science Institute, Cayuga Lake Watershed Network, and Discover Cayuga Lake. And the goals of this program are to collect real-time data on HABs and provide that data to local communities and municipalities, data about where and when HABs are occurring. And we're wanting to continuously also collect data on HABs trends on Cayuga Lake. And so there's kind of two pieces of this. There's the public health piece where we're informing communities. This map shows what our map has looked like in the past on our reporting page. And we've heard from a lot of community members from different parts of the lake that they'll visit this map before they take their families to the lake. They'll visit this map before they go to the lake with their friends because they want to see where there have and haven't been harmful algal blooms recently. And so we know that this is a really useful tool for a lot of community members, just everyday people in the area. And the second piece of the data or the second goal of this program is to continue to collect data and use that for additional means, such as scientific publications, to try and continue to further our understanding of HABs, because we know some things about HABs, but there's also a lot of patterns that we don't necessarily understand. There's a lot of regional variation. And so that's the other goal of this program, is to better understand the patterns and to capture long-term data on them. And one of the ways that we're seeing that play out right now is that data that was collected by many of you in this program is currently being used in a scientific publication that's in review. So this data, you know, I know it can probably feel discouraging to go out and you're collecting data on this occurrence that you don't want to see, and we tend to see increases in numbers year by year. But there's also, I want to share with you that there's also positives that are coming out of this program. We're helping spread public health information, and we know that people use that, and we are advancing scientific understanding of HABs with the data that we collect. So yeah, before we move on, this map shows the way that we've collected data in the past, or the way that we've displayed data in the past. And this year, instead of using this map on our CSI's website, we're going to show data on our database instead. And I'll give you a tour of that before we finish this training. But I just want to give you a heads up. It's going to be a little different this year. But if you accidentally go to this page, we'll have a link to the database. So it's all good. You'll be able to find it no matter what. Yeah, so on a broad scale, each of you, HABs Harriers, you're assigned a stretch of shoreline that is called your zone. If you don't have an assigned shoreline yet, fill out the form in the chat, which I'll paste again. And you can give me some information about what your experience is with harmful algal blooms, whether you have any kits, and also let me know if you don't have a zone or a kit yet, and I'll be able to follow up with you. And I'll get in touch with you soon to assign a zone if you don't have one. But so everybody will have a zone, and your weekly duty is to survey your zone and report back to CSI. That's the nuts and bolts of the program from your perspective. And Philip, yes, if you did, the kits do not become outdated, and if you did Harry last year, this also helps me keep track of attendance at this, so I can see who's already attended a meeting and not send you another email with a link to this recording. So yes, if you have a kit from last year, you can keep using that, but please let me know so that we can keep track of where all of our bottles are. Okay, so this is the program from your perspective. Then once we get those blooms, those samples in the lab, then CSI follows kind of our own protocol. So first we look at the bloom under a microscope to see if we see cyanobacteria in the sample. If we don't see cyanobacteria, then we remove the pin from our public map where it was posted as a suspicious bloom. We remove it if we don't see cyanobacteria because that's not a harmful algal bloom. If we do see cyanobacteria in the sample, we confirm it on the map and we report what cyanobacteria we see. And then we run 2 lab analyses. We have chlorophyll A, which roughly correlates to the bloom's density. And then we have microcystin, and that is one possible cyanotoxin that can be generated by cyanobacteria. And it's the only toxin for which there's a certified test. So this kind of comes back to what we talked about with CSI having a certified lab. This is the only toxin that we can have that result for that carries this additional weight that it can hold up in court or that it can be regulatory quality. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for you. But the important thing is this is one possible toxin and it's what we use for research, but it's not a definitive measurement of whether a bloom is safe or not. So if we get really low microcystin toxin levels, that doesn't mean that the bloom is okay to make contact with. If you see a bloom and it has cyanobacteria in it, you should always avoid that regardless of what results we see for microcystin. Okay, so that's kind of a bird's eye view of the program. Now let's talk about what each of you is going to do each week. So the HABs season on Cayuga Lake typically starts in July and lasts through the end of September. And within that time, you commit to surveying your zone weekly. We know that people go on vacation, so if you're allowed to be a person, but do let me know, and then we can try and maintain the coverage of that zone if you're out of town. But the commitment is weekly monitoring from July 1st to September 31st. And that could look like kayaking the length of your zone. I know we have some people who kayak. Could look like walking the length of your zone. If there's another approach that you have that gets you to lay eyes on every part of your zone, then that's totally fine. So when you go do your weekly survey, you'll want to bring your sampling kit with you. This is a picture of that on the right. And that'll have this jar that has amber glass. And it has this tracking sheet where you'll fill out some information, and then it also gives you gloves. So you'll go out. If you don't see a bloom, we ask that you submit a no bloom report once a week if you can. This is really easy to forget, and I know that, so I will remind you weekly in my weekly emails where I give you a summary of what's gone on that week. And I recognize that it's really easy to forget to do this, but I want to let you know that it's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps us see who's engaged in the program. And so, if you're having a really rough time, if you're not able to go and monitor your shoreline, and I see that you're not submitting a no bloom report every week, that gives me an indication that it might make sense for me to reach out to you and see what's going on. What kind of support do you need? Is it too much? Is it too big of a zone and you can't see all of it every week? Or, would it be helpful if we had somebody else go with you or kind of tag team that zone? So that's helpful for that reason. It's also helpful because every time you submit a no bloom report, that tells us that at that moment there was not a bloom on the lake. And so if you submit a no bloom report on Monday morning, and then later that day you go out and you see that there is a bloom, then we know that that bloom occurred in the last few hours. Whereas if you haven't submitted a no bloom report for many weeks, it could be that this is an old bloom and we don't have that hard data that it did not, it was not visible, it was not present, however long before that. Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is a Google form, and I will send out a reminder email every week where I'll tell you where we've found blooms, how many blooms we've found, and I'll also have a link to this report as a little reminder to please fill that out. And so that you don't have to be concerned about finding that link again. We do encourage people to bookmark that as well, because that might be easier, but I will make sure that you always have access to that regardless. Okay, if you do see a bloom, there's 4 steps that we want you to take. We want you to take photos, collect a sample, fill out your paperwork, and then get that sample to CSI. And we'll go through those one by one. For photos, we ask you to take one photo that's close up. This gives us an idea of some of those visual characteristics of a bloom, and then from far away, that helps us see how widespread it is. So if it's some blooms will only last for one property, and some of them will go a little bit further, and having these visuals helps us to gauge how widespread that bloom is. Then we'll ask you to collect a sample. So as I mentioned, your sampling kit will have 3 things in it. These gloves, it'll have this amber glass bottle, and then it has this tracking sheet. And so this bottle is important. This has to do with the certification of our lab. So basically the state sets guidelines for how labs are able to collect data that stays certified or that is allowed to be certified. And this bottle is one of the things that allows our microcystin toxin data to be certified data. So if you don't have a bottle and you only have one chance to collect a sample, we can still look at the cyanobacteria levels in a bloom that you bring in any other bottle, but we can't look at the microcystin toxin unless you use this bottle. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you always have a sampling kit, and to collect a sample in that sampling kit whenever possible. Yes, then we have gloves, we have this tracking sheet. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you collect your sample is label the bottle. It'll have a label that looks just like this on it. And so as you fill that out, the water body name is always going to be Cayuga Lake. and then you'll have a sample code that will correspond to your zone number. So that's the same. So each zone that's on Cayuga Lake will start with the number 34. And then beyond that, you'll have whatever number corresponds to your zone. So I have this example 3447. And then the B corresponds to the bloom that the numerical kind of counting of the blooms in that zone. So if it's the first bloom that you've seen that season, then you'll write B1. But if you've collected a bunch of different blooms, then you'll write, you know, if it's the 5th bloom that you've seen in your zone, you'll write B5. Then you'll write, of course, the date that you collected it, the time that you sampled it, and then your name, which I have my name there. Yeah, so that's what you'll do. It's easiest if you fill this out before you dip your bottle in the water. It's possible to do it afterward, but then you might have some gunk on your bottle, so it's a little easier if you do this first. Then we want everyone to always wear gloves. This protects you from the toxins that are in the water. One of the things that can happen, even if there aren't really intense toxins, people can get skin irritation just from making contact with the water. And so, yeah, please wear the gloves to keep yourself safe. And then we want you to sample the densest part of the bloom. And so that's because on our database, we want to give the worst case scenario of what this bloom could look like. And so in this bloom, I gave an example of one that looks like it's slightly sparser in some areas and denser in others. So if it were me, I would probably sample about right here. That looks like a pretty dense, intense piece of the bloom right there. That's probably going to capture it at about its worst. And then, of course, you want to keep the sample on ice. So a lot of people will bring a cooler out with them, or if you bring it home, we want you to keep it in your refrigerator until you're able to transport it, which we'll talk about more soon. And then as you transport it, if you can keep it in a cooler on ice, that helps keep the sample as pristine as possible. And that's also part of those results being certified. Are there any questions about collecting a sample before we move on? I'll look at
I do have one. Part of, if I'm thinking just about where we live, there are areas like our dock that doesn't have direct water access.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in that case? Are there any creative ways? Can I like attach the bottle to a stick or something?
So, I mean, I have seen photos of people who have used really creative ways. So if anyone wants to pipe in with their own tips, otherwise I can come up with something. Yeah, I think some people have like cut off the end of a broom and connected that to it. If you have rubber boots and you rinse them off really well afterward, I think that is a way that you could safely probably wade into it, but I would definitely make sure that you have some kind of watertight boots that you can have with that. I think it's not recommended to boat in a bloom, but I think if you carefully, if you have a kayak or a canoe, if you carefully go out and you make sure you're not splashing. I know that there are people who kayak the length of their shorelines to collect samples. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
And then thank you everybody for correcting me about the number of days in September. There are only 30 days, which several of you noticed. And then we have a question from Dorothy. Do you want multiple samples for a week, e.g. no bloom on day 1, then a bloom on day 3, then a markedly more extensive bloom on day 4? This is a great question. I'm so glad that you brought this up. Basically there's a couple of different elements to the answer of this. We want to know when you have harmful algal blooms, and we want to be alerted of that, and we want to capture as much data as possible, but we also do have limited resources. And so that's why we ask you to monitor weekly. So if you see a bloom and we ask that you not consider a second bloom a different bloom unless the first bloom has disappeared for 24 full hours. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay.
Even if it
Um,
gets worse, you don't want,
sorry?
even if it gets worse, we
If
should
it- so
not
if it
bring
gets-
another sample.
Yeah, I think even if it gets worse, just because we're a really small staff at CSI and we won't necessarily, we can capture some piece of that data without having to sample multiple days in a row. What I would ask that you do, especially if you're seeing a bloom for more than like a week or more than several days, is you can still send me an email with additional pictures, and then I can go on our database and update that and say, as of this many days later, we're still seeing a bloom, or the bloom seems to have intensified, or this photo is from this many days later, something like that. So you can still have that qualitative public health information come through, even though we may not have the capacity to test an additional sample from the same bloom.
So if I normally test on Mondays and I don't see a bloom, and then all of a sudden on Thursday, I'm out and I see a bloom, should I then test that day?
Yes. So if you go and do your no bloom report and then you see a bloom on a different day, we would like you to collect that. But if you see a bloom on Monday and then you go out again and you're not sure whether it's dissipated and you still, or maybe again are seeing a bloom on Wednesday or Thursday, then maybe report that to us qualitatively, but don't collect a sample.
And does the collection week start on Monday and end on Friday, or does it go through the weekend?
I think honestly, I can't remember what I did last year. I don't really have a strong preference. So just for the sake of simplicity, let's say it starts on Monday and goes through Sunday. And I will remember that for myself. And that's how I'll count the no bloom reports and all that.
Thank you.
Several years ago, a volunteer who I don't remember their name, but there was a video about, he had a way of attaching a clamp to a stick that you could and then put your bottle in the clamp, and it works really well. So I don't know if you still have contact with Nate or if anybody else remembers where to access that video.
Bill Ebert.
Sorry?
That's Bill Ebert who did that.
Okay, I'll ask Bill for that.
Yeah, it works great.
And then what was the other?
Can
Oh.
you give a detailed description of how to physically take the sample?
Yes, so when you take the sample, you put your gloves on, you take the lid off of the bottle as well as possible, as well as it's accessible. You go to the densest part of the bloom, dip the bottle in and fill it as full as you can. If you can only get half of a bottle, that is enough for us to do a sample, but it's always good to have a little extra just in case something happens. So we want you to fill it as full as you can. Then put the lid back on and then put it in the bag so that then that all that cyanobacteria and any associated toxins don't get on anything else.
Do you want us to keep the opening at the surface so
Yes.
you're collecting a large
Yes, I do.
volume of the bacteria?
That's what, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Diane. Then I have a question here from Lynn. Do the bottles contain a buffer solution as they have in the past? They do not. No, the bottles are empty. And
If you take a sample and it's you put it, can you put it on ice and then and find out a couple days later there's a much more dense sample and we'd rather send in the dense one, or does it not?
I think if you haven't brought in the less dense sample, then maybe you could, but I would err on the side of not taking more than one sample per week, even if it looks a little bit denser. Just because that it adds more, that means that there's more bottle distribution that's necessary. There's basically a lot of logistical challenges that come with sampling more frequently. Although, of course, in an ideal world, we would capture every single sample every single day and always be able to look at that. But in reality, that's going to be probably more challenging and not ultimately end up being possible on Community Science Institute's end.
Oh, if we take a sample, we have to get it to you the same day, otherwise it's
No.
really no good. Is that right?
No.
Yes, that's also right, and I'll get into that soon. Ray had the question, is the zone ID a precise enough indication of location on the lake? No, but the next step in this presentation is about how to get the location data. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, is everyone ready to move on? Any final questions before we move forward?
I just put one in the chat, Grace. Do you still want us to collect even if it's questionable, even if we're not absolutely sure?
Yeah, I would say,
Okay.
similarly, if you recently collected a bloom and then there's a questionable one a couple of days later, let's err on the side of once a week. But if you see something out on your weekly walk, feel free to take a sample, and that's good information for me and also for all of you that you'll send in a picture, and then if I look at that bloom under the microscope and I don't see any cyanobacteria, which has happened before, not very frequently, typically our harriers, I think the numbers are, our harriers get the blooms correct like 95% of the time based on cyanobacteria. So you all are very, very good and very consistently good at identifying blooms by sight. But occasionally it has happened that, can you all see me still?
Yes.
Okay, I was told I was logged out of this. So occasionally it will happen that you'll collect a sample that looks like it's kind of a questionable bloom and then I won't see cyanobacteria. If that's the case, I'll reach back out to you just so that you know that thing that you saw as a data point for your own understanding of HABs and familiarity with what they look like. That particular one did not look like a HAB. But still, I encourage you, if you're not sure, feel free to collect it and then I'll just reflect that back to you.
What about antitoxin testing? I've done that for you several times in the past.
I'm not certain yet. Basically, we only have limited or only in-kind funding to do antitoxin A testing. And so typically we'll pick a couple of people to do an antitoxin test a couple of times per year. So I will reach out to you individually if you are selected as the antitoxin person. But overall, that's kind of a separate piece of the program.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Okay, now we'll move on. There will be more time at the end if you think of any other questions. Okay, so the next piece of collecting a bloom is your paperwork, and that is mainly this chain of custody or tracking sheet. So we've written on the bottle, we collected our sample, and then we have this paperwork, which is the last thing in our sample kit. So some of the info that you fill out on here is information that we'll end up posting on the HABs page, which is now the database. And then other info that you fill out on here has to do with, again, with CSI's lab certification. And so basically, for us to be certified, we have to be able to account for that sample from the moment that it's collected all the way through the end of its testing. And so this sheet helps us understand where it's been before it reaches our lab. So most of this is pretty self-explanatory, but we'll go through it anyway, just for a thorough understanding. So first thing we're going to look at, first you'll fill out your name and contact info. That's fairly self-explanatory. If you don't know your name, then you need to talk to someone besides me. Then we'll look at, the next thing that we'll look at is where exactly the bloom was collected. So this gets into that question about whether a zone number is exact enough. So we have the zone number. We'll have you just fill out whatever your zone number is, or if you're not sure, you can leave this blank as long as you give us the coordinates. So we'll want to have latitude and longitude there if at all possible. And if that's not possible, you can give us the nearest address and we can approximate the latitude and longitude from that. So there's a couple of ways you can get latitude and longitude. If you do have a smartphone, On an iPhone, there's a compass app that will itself give you the coordinates. If you open the app, then just wherever you're standing, it'll give you the GPS coordinates of your location. If you don't have an iPhone and you have Google Maps, you can open up your Google Maps, either the app or the on web browser. You can double click on a spot on the map, and then there will be GPS coordinates that pop up below that. And if not, there's usually metadata on photos. If you take a photo of the bloom, we should be able to figure out where that is if you send that photo to us, or just sending us an approximate address will be helpful. Okay, the next thing is going to be the location description and the date and time. This description, it's a good place to put any observations that you have, either about like, oh, this is right next to the dock. This was right next to, you know, the swimming area. But it's also a good place to put observations like, this bloom was well mixed in the water table, or this bloom seemed like it was only hovering right alongside the shoreline, things like that. Then you want to write down the date and time that you collected the bloom, and then the date and the time that you first observed the bloom. And if you aren't sure when you first observed it, that's okay, as long as you write when it was collected. That's the most important thing. Next, you're going to fill out bloom extent. So I want to hear from some veteran HABs harriers. How do you determine whether it's a small localized, a large localized, or a widespread bloom?
Eye test.
Eye test. Say more about that.
Say large, widespread, sometimes we'll see it going all the way out in the lake. And so that'd be widespread. Otherwise, if it's just right around my dock, it's obviously small. And then I just look around, and if I see it up at my neighbors on either side, then it's a large localized.
Yeah, it's a great tip.
I will walk my third of a mile along the railroad bed, and if I continue to see it all along the edge, then I would say that it's localized, widespread localized, but not out in the middle of the lake.
I think that's, yeah, I think that's a great tip. This is another one, you know, kind of like with those partway there blooms, this is qualitative data. So there's some component of this bloom extent that's going to be a judgment call. And that's okay, because, you know, we're not claiming that this is an exact number of properties, but it's still useful information to see how widespread it seems like it is. We have a lot of quantitative data to complement this qualitative data. And then finally, the last piece is this chain of custody at the bottom. So in this chain of custody, this helps us see when that bloom has changed hands. So the first thing that you'll want to do, you collect a sample and you're dropping it off at CSI's lab maybe. Whenever you give that bloom either to somebody else who's transporting that bloom, or when you drop it off at CSI, or when you hand it to me, we want you to write your initials under relinquished by, along with the date and the time that you trade that bloom. Sorry, is that a question? Okay, so that's a little bit, that's easier to do when you're handing the bloom directly off to us, and a little bit more difficult if you're dropping it off for somebody else to transport. So if you're dropping that off for someone else to transport, then you say you're giving it to your neighbor to take. You sign relinquished by and write the date and the time, and your neighbor signs accepted by. Then your neighbor, who's driving it down to Community Science Institute, when they get to Community Science Institute, they write relinquished by and the date and the time, and then CSI writes accepted by. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay, so that's, again, that has to do with seeing where this bloom has changed hands, at what time, and kind of how many different points that different people have held it and passed it on to other people. Okay, so now we'll talk about sample transport. And in my opinion, this is the most, this is the trickiest part of the HAB sampling process, just because it's a lot of logistics. So CSI needs to receive the sample that you collected as soon as possible. And that's, again, because of our certification. So we have to test for microcystin within 48 hours. And we have to, the sooner we receive that bloom, the easier it is for us to try and fit that into the rest of the lab's schedule. So when you receive, or when you collect a sample, we want you to send two messages. We want you to send a message to your quadrant leader. So depending on which quadrant you're in, that could be any of these people here who I'll send out information for all of them. And then we of course want you to alert CSI and the network, which you can do by commenting or by sending an email to habshotline@gmail.com or by filling out this report, which is kind of like the counterpart of a no bloom report. It's a yes bloom report. And when you fill these things out, we want you to include photos, your GPS coordinates, and the date and time that you collected the sample. Was there a question? Okay, so then the sample transportation itself, we're doing something slightly different this year to try and make sure that it's as not taxing on all of you who are collecting the blooms as possible. So we have a team of people whose whole job is transportation, and that's for folks on the north side of the lake. We can arrange a pickup if you aren't able to transport it if you're on the southern end, but what we would hope for is if you are within a reasonable driving distance, that in the southwest and southeast quadrants, you would still transport that sample yourself. So after contacting your quadrant leader and habshotline@gmail.com, we would like you to transport your sample to CSI's laboratory. Just so all of you know, I will send all of this out in a packet, and I'll have specific instructions based on your quadrant. So don't feel like you need to write all of this down, but this is just to give you kind of an idea. So you collect a bloom, you've sent the email, you've filled out all your paperwork. The next thing we want you to do is on ice, bring the sample to our address at Community Science Institute. And that's Langmuir Lab, which is at 95 Brown Road in Ithaca. If it's during business hours, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, you can drop it off in room 283, where we'll all be working. And if it is not during business hours, you can bring it around the back of the building where there's this little shed, and that has a refrigerator in it. Sorry, this should say refrigerator. This is an old picture. We used to have a cooler, but now we have a plugged-in fridge. So it's all official, and that bloom will definitely stay cold enough. And then because you were very responsible and sent an email to HABs hotline, I will know immediately, or somebody else who's available, and they'll go collect that sample and bring it inside as soon as possible so that we can get that ready to be tested for microcystin. So this is for southwest and southeast quadrants. If you are in the northwest quadrant, we have a spot where you can drop the sample off at Ken Reamer's house. We have a couple of people, I think, who are in the northwest of the lake. That means north of Sheldrake Point.
Yeah, Ken is great. He takes it across by his boat. How about that?
Actually, this year it's a little different. This year we're going to have people, he might still do that sometimes, but this year we're mostly going to have people, we have a few people who volunteered who are in like the Trumansburg, Saganic area, who will drive up and drive it down, just because we don't have, we don't want to overtax the people on the east side of the lake, which I think may have happened a bit last year. But either way, if you're in the northwestern quadrant, you contact the people we said before, and then you also contact Eileen Percival. I guess you already contacted her because she's your quadrant leader. Oops. And then you also contact Ken Reamer, and you're going to drive to his house, and you're going to drop off a sample in his driveway. He will have the cooler out of sight of the road so that nobody decides to help themselves to a free cooler. And so it's at this address, which again will be in your packet that I'll give you, your your instructions. It's about a 1/4 mile south of Dean's Cove. You can drive into, you let him know you're on your way, so he makes sure there's ice in the cooler. You drive into his driveway and you drop it off. His address, his home has a Canada Goose mailbox, so you'll know that when you see it. And he said there's a good spot to turn around, so you can drive up his driveway, put it in the cooler, and then make a turnaround at the end of the driveway. And he also wanted me to let everyone know, you know, if he's getting calls from unknown numbers, please, if he doesn't answer, please do leave a message, because he'll check those, but he may not answer it right away. So you can call him or text him, and if he doesn't answer, leave a message, and then you can be on your merry way to go to his house. Yeah. So big thanks to Ken for being willing to do that. That's really helpful. That's the northwestern quadrant. Then if you're in the northeastern quadrant, we still don't have a quadrant leader for that area. So if you're in that quadrant and you want some extra responsibility, please let me know. We could really, really use you. But we will be okay with that also if need be. So yeah, for the northeastern quadrant, it's a similar story, except you don't have a quadrant leader to contact. So you'll email HABs hotline, and then you'll drop your sample off at the Village of Aurora Firehouse. So that's at this address, and we'll have a cooler there. And in both of these locations, there will be replacement sampling kits. So you collect your sample, you drop your sample off at the appropriate location, and then you grab a new sampling bottle. And those should be available at these drop-off locations or at CSI's lab. So anywhere where you're giving a sample, you should be able to also take a sampling kit. Okay, so that's basically the nuts and bolts of your responsibility in the program. I have a little more that I want to share about what we do on the lab end, but I want to give you all a chance to ask questions if you have any about sample transport. Okay, looks like there's no questions.
I have a question. Are you sending somebody up to Aurora to pick it up?
We have a few people in Aurora who are willing to be, so basically this year, the main thing that's different is we're recruiting volunteers whose exclusive volunteer duty is to collect and transport samples that other people have collected. Because we know that you're all working really hard to survey your shoreline weekly, and because you're volunteering as HABs Harriers, presumably the piece that you really enjoy is being out on the lake. And there's other people who might be more interested in, some people really enjoy driving. Some people may not have the mobility to collect the samples themselves. But we also can really use their help transporting the samples. So we have a few people who are in or near Aurora and will be willing to kind of be a part of a phone tree, basically. So you'll drop the sample off, we hear about it at HABs hotline, and then the quadrant leaders and the watershed network and me at CSI, we all talk about, we all make a bunch of calls to the people who are the transporters, and then they go to that location either at Ken's house or at the firehouse, and they pick up that sample and they take it to CSI's lab, depending on who's available. So we have people kind of on call for that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ray, you probably could. Southwest quadrant leader, Harriet, is Glenn Radijak. Glenn, I don't know if you're here, but if you are, correct me if I'm saying that wrong. But I will have all of that information in the packet that I send you all. And that'll basically be this entire presentation in written form, so that if you forget anything and you don't want to watch this very, very long YouTube video of me saying this to all of you, you can just refer back to that written down.
You mean the southeast?
Yes,
Quadrant
I'm
leader
so
is
sorry,
Glenn.
you're right. I meant the southeast quadrant.
The
Southwest
southwest is
quadrant.
Andy Yale, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Andy. So this year in the southwest quadrant, we have co-leaders, and they're Andy and John Abel. Andy, go ahead.
Yes, myself and John Abel. And we're happy to help. So a job in the past of quadrant leaders has been to help people to verify that it actually was a HAB if they have some question about it. And we can continue doing that.
Great.
I think it I don't know why I'm getting an echo, but I thought our leader had extra kits available too one year. I
That's
don't know
also
what was
true.
last year.
Yeah. So basically
Possibly.
the way that I will get all of you kits this year, all of you who are coming to this virtual meeting, is I will send the kits, get the kits to your quadrant leaders, and then your quadrant leaders, you can go pick them up from them, or they can distribute them in whatever way works for you and your particular situation. But also in the places where you drop them off, I think that it's important to have extra kits there as well, just in case your quadrant leader might be busy or might not be, might have run out of kits and need to run down to Ithaca to pick some up or something like that. So there's multiple options for that, but they are definitely somebody that you can count on to contact if you're in need of a kit.
It would be great to have one at the drop-off locations if necessary, because you can drop off and pick up at the same time.
I've already given Ken some extra kits, so don't worry about that. Yeah,
Awesome.
that's a great thought. Yeah,
And he's
yeah.
he's my neighbor, so I can actually walk to him.
Hey, oh, that's awesome. Yeah, Ken's great. He might win the MVP of the HABs Harriers this year. Okay, any last questions before we move on to kind of some final HABs stuff in the lab? Okay. So I already went into this a little, so I'll keep it a little brief, but so when we get those samples in CSI's lab, the first thing we do is we look at the cyanobacteria, and the two main, we identify it to genus, and the two main genera, which is the plural of genus, that we see of cyanobacteria in blooms on Cayuga Lake are Microcystis, and then the genus Delicospermum. And so these two, basically we look at the bloom under the microscope, and almost always we see one of these as the dominant form of cyanobacteria. And so we will we'll enumerate and kind of say whether they look like they're sparse, moderate, or dense, and whether one of them seems to be dominating the sample more than the other one in terms of how present they are. And so these are interesting because these are we see different patterns in these over the course of the summer. So at the beginning of the summer, we see much more Delicospermum being dominant in the blooms and being densely represented in the blooms. As the summer goes on, we see a mixture and some co-dominance often of Microcystis and Delicospermum. And then more and more as the season wears on, we see more Microcystis. And Microcystis is known to be a relatively big producer of microcystin, which is the toxin that we look at. And so it's interesting because depending on what the cyanobacteria composition is, we can see some trends in what the microcystin toxin concentration is as well. And so that's kind of one of the things that we're looking into scientifically with these data is what kinds of trends and what kinds of relationships do we see between the cyanobacteria composition, the chlorophyll A concentration, and the microcystin toxin concentration. The chlorophyll A roughly corresponds to how dense the bloom is, and a good ballpark for that, if you see it on our database, is a bloom. When you see a bloom, typically the chlorophyll A level will be greater than 25 micrograms per liter. And there are some exceptions, but that's kind of a good rule of thumb. And then finally, microcystin toxin. There are limits set by the EPA and used by the New York State Department of Health for microcystin toxin. So for drinking water, the limit that's set is 0.3 micrograms per liter. And for contact recreation, which is like swimming or fishing, that limit is 4 micrograms per liter. And it's important always to just remind you that it's never safe to make contact with the bloom. The microcystin toxin is for the sake of scientific exploration. It is not a definitive, a low microcystin toxin concentration does not guarantee that a bloom is safe to touch. So never touch a bloom. Finally, we'll talk about staying up to date. So CSI has our HABs reporting page. which will now be on our database, which I'll talk about soon. Then the network will continue to send out their weekly updates to the public. They have a new summer employee. Is Ashley, are you here? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. It's great to meet everyone. I'm looking forward to working with you. I'm a rising senior at Cornell, and I'll be working with the network as the harmful algal blooms and climate change communication intern.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so Ashley will be writing this weekly newsletter. And so, yeah, we're really excited to see how she makes it her own. And then finally on Discover Cayuga Lake, they'll be doing Sunday community cruises that anybody can go on, where they'll survey the open water in that area of Cayuga Lake for harmful algal blooms. And so that will be, they have a lot going on those cruises besides the community, or besides harmful algal bloom monitoring. But that's kind of a new addition to the program and the way that they're staying involved with us. And if anyone's interested in a little bit of extra time, we would welcome any harmful algal bloom harrier who wants to be in attendance on one of those cruises to help educate the folks who are volunteering just on a week-to-week basis with surveying the open water. Yeah, so let me know if you are interested in that. So now we'll talk about the database. This is, I think, the last thing we'll talk about before we finally wrap up. So, okay, our database is still somewhat in development. It's still undergoing some improvements, but it is now accessible, at least the home page, which has this map like you've seen on our other page. And you can find that at this URL, database.communityscience.org/HAB. And once the rest of it goes public, this link will continue to work. So this is a good link to keep and write down and continue to refer to. And now I just want to open it and we'll kind of explore together, and I'll show you some of the features that it has.
Last year, or one of the years, there was a lot of talk that Cayuga Lake had the most harmful algae blooms. And I just wondered if that's because we have the most harriers, or is it really the worst lake?
This is a very common question, and the answer is we aren't certain, because we do have a lot of harriers, and we have one of the things that I think is really exciting and beautiful about this lake and the people who are on it is that even though there are a lot of harmful algal blooms, we also have a lot of really engaged community members who are all coming together because we care about this issue. And so the fact that we're seeing a lot more blooms and cataloging a lot more blooms does show community engagement. It also probably, my guess, which it's hard to say because these two variables kind of make it hard to tease apart what the real answer is, but my guess would be a little bit of both. That we see more blooms than other lakes because we have so many harriers, but also we see a lot of blooms, and perhaps there are more blooms than on other lakes, but maybe not as many as there appear to be. So sorry, that's a kind of a cop-out answer, but that's the best we can know. Okay, so this is what the home page of the database looks like. So here on the left, on the right side, you have this map that's very similar to the map that we've seen on our Cayuga Lake HABs reporting page on CSI's main website. And so this has the same colors that you've seen on those that correspond to microcystin toxin limits. Last year, we switched to purple instead of red to make sure that anyone who's colorblind can still get the same visual, have it be visually apparent which blooms are highly toxic and which are less toxic. So this map defaults to every bloom that we've seen since the very beginning of this program. And so when you come to this page and you see it just completely covered, don't be alarmed. That's because that's all of the blooms. And if you want to see only recent blooms, you're able to use this drop-down menu to specify these different periods of time. So what you might do if you're looking to go swimming is click on last 7 days. And of course, because it's June, there have been no blooms in the past 7 days, thank goodness. But if we're in the middle of HAB season, this instead would pop up with the blooms from those most recent days. Then we have over here on the left side, we have this tally of all the blooms that were ever recorded. We have a breakdown of the percentages of the blooms that we've looked at that had microcystin concentrations greater than the contact recreation limit, or those that are below the drinking water limit, etc. We have the HABs by bloom size. So that's what we were kind of talking about with widespread, large, localized, small, localized. It shows you the percentage that have fallen into each category. Then we have segments for the entire lake. And so these segments are different than your zones. And that's because your zones are the zones that we've assigned, everybody are very dependent on each individual person's capacity and on kind of what the geography looks like in that particular area. And so that's really useful in assigning and keeping track of where people are monitoring, but it's not as useful when you're looking at trends throughout Cayuga Lake. So these segments are more divided based on like public areas and areas of interest. So for example, like a state park might be one zone, and then the spot between that one segment, not one zone. A state park might be one segment, and then the area between that state park and like the next public swimming beach might be another segment. So they're different sizes, but they correspond to areas of interest. So so you can click on each of these, and then that'll pull up this other page that's focused only on each segment. So this is segment Northeast 1. And so the first thing is like on the rest of the database, we have this map of that area that we're zooming into, and it has all of the blooms that we've ever seen in this segment. And then we have this auto-populated graph that will show you the patterns of HABs over the course of the months of the year and over the course of the years that we've had our program. And so unfortunately, June is out of order on this one, but it will be in the first slot once we get some of these final updates done on the database. But you can see the x-axis is the months, and those will be in order of months. And then on the y-axis, we have the number of HABs that have been reported. Then we have these different color codes that correspond to the different years. And this is kind of a lot of information. So if we wanted to just look at 2022, we can toggle these years off and on. And so then you can see only the patterns of HABs July, August, and September in 2022. Or maybe if you just want to compare 2020 to 2022, you can select those two and see kind of, oh, look, 2020 had far more HABs in July and August than 2022 did. And then finally, we have these individual blooms. So you can click on an individual bloom and go to that page. That's going to once again show you this map with the bloom itself color-coded to the microcystin toxin concentration. And then we have the bloom code, which this will correspond to your zone. So if you're looking for where your zone's reflected, this is where you can find it. Then we have the where, which has the latitude and longitude, the segment that it's located in, and the extent of the bloom, and the county. We have the when, which shows you when the bloom was reported, when it was sampled, and when we looked at it under the scope to see what cyanobacteria was present. And so this is a really good way to see how good our program is, because we see, you know, somebody observed and reported this the same day that they collected that sample. That sample got collected the same day, then it got to the lab, and we also looked at it under a microscope within that same day. And so it shows how quick that turnaround is. Thanks, Michelle. Then on the bottom here, we have some of the specifics of the bloom itself. So we have the bloom genera. This shows, as in many of our blooms, there's only these two genera of cyanobacteria, Microcystis and Delicospermum. And then we have listed whether they're present or whether they're dominant. And sometimes it'll say dominant from both of them. That's if they're co-dominant. So because in some of them, they are represented at approximately equal levels. Yeah, then we have our chlorophyll A concentration and our total microcystin concentration. This corresponds to the chemical method that we use to test for this. So for all intents and purposes, this is microcystin toxin. Yeah, so that's our database. And let me see, we have a couple of, oh, okay. Just good thoughts on the database, which is great to hear. And then let's see, we are still looking for volunteers in all of these places highlighted in red. So red corresponds to places where the shoreline is not currently surveyed. So if you have neighbors, there's a good chance that we hear from people all the time, oh, my neighbor surveys for HABs, so I don't have to. And that's true, nobody has to. But it could be that your neighbors think that it's already covered and they don't think about the fact that they could be making your volunteer duties a little bit easier by helping you out. So, you know, we encourage you all to talk to your neighbors if you think they might be interested, or just spread the word so that people know about our program and can look to it to learn more about where blooms have occurred. And yeah, that's all I've got. So I'll take any questions. And then we'll turn it over to Liz to talk about lake-friendly living. Any final questions before we finish up?
I have one. If we have someone who's interested, but they're unable to attend the in-person event, are they able to watch the recording and then become, oh, awesome.
Yeah, that's why we record this. So I'll post this on YouTube, unfortunately, with all of the snafus that we've had for people to be able to learn from it as well. And then I'll be in contact with them directly to answer any questions that they might have that didn't come up at this training. There's people every year who, you know, we only have so much capacity to do trainings, but we want everyone to have the opportunity to come. So yeah, thank you for asking.
I have questions. Excuse me. Can we see on the map the existing zones by numbers that we could do last year?
So that map I've created internally, and I would be happy to share that with only Harriers if that would be useful. The reason why we don't have that publicly shared is because we've put people's contact information in on that for us to kind of look at, and I want to make sure that I'm respecting everyone's privacy. But if everyone is okay with me sharing that within the Harrier group, and if everybody is if everyone's comfortable with that, and if you think that that would be helpful to see, I am open to sharing that. I want to make sure that we're doing that with everybody's consent for sharing that information, or I can perhaps make another one that doesn't have personal information on it.
Yeah, as a Southwest coordinator, it was useful for me to see where the zones were.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
So
yeah, well, I can certainly share that with the quadrant leaders, and if everybody else is interested, I can share it. But if it seems like a lot to keep track of, I don't have to by any means.
okay. My second question. Last year, we had a flyer that we could hand out to people in our zone, who particularly renters who were just there for short periods. Will you be distributing that again?
I'm happy to. Yes, I have actually a bunch of additional copies of that. So I'm thinking it probably would make the most sense if I printed out some additional copies of that and shared them with quadrant leaders along with the kits that they'll be distributing to everybody.
Good idea.
That's useful if people in the neighborhood wonder why I'm kayaking around their docks.
Sure, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay. And third question is, are you going to send out all the links and the other things to us?
Yes, I will send those out. I'm going to follow up within the week with the packet. The packet will be a digital copy, and it will have all those links embedded in it. And then I will also send all those links out individually in an email, so that you'll have multiple ways to refer back and find them. And then of course, I'll send out those weekly summaries of what we saw in terms of HABs. And I will have the links in there as well. I see a question from Harriet. Sorry, John, did you have anything else? Okay, I see a question from Harriet about whether the blue gloves are recyclable or reusable. I think technically from an official lab perspective, you are not supposed to reuse gloves. I, as someone who hates throwing single-use things away, I suppose you can use your judgment on that one, but it's definitely, I want to be clear that that's not recommended from like a lab safety perspective. Unfortunately, a lot of things in lab safety are single use. All right, Liz, go ahead and take it away. I allowed you to share, so that should be smooth.
Great, thanks, Grace. Get set up here. All right, are you looking at the full slide? Okay, wonderful. So thanks, Grace. That was awesome. It's just amazing how much work goes into this program. And thank you for inviting me to share a little bit about the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network's Lake Friendly Living program. You met Ashley already from the network, but for those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Liz. I'm the steward and executive director of our organization. And we are just so proud to be working with CSI on the Cayuga Lakes HAB program. It is truly unique because of all the work of the HABs carriers. It is the most comprehensive HABs data set in New York State, and it can be used to inform that HABs research and keep the public safe. But I recognize as a scientist myself, I'm a watershed ecologist and environmental educator by training, that I know it's very exciting, but also at times somewhat discouraging to be documenting water quality problems year after year, which is why I want to update you on the Cayuga Lake Friendly Living program and some opportunities that you can take right away to promote watershed health at home yourself. Before we get into Lake Friendly Living, I just want to share a little bit of info about our organization. If you aren't familiar with us, we are a 25-year-old not-for-profit, and simply put, our mission is to advocate for the health of Cayuga Lake and its watershed in a changing world. And the changes that our watershed is facing come in many forms. That's climate change, land use change, invasive species, and pollution. And in order to rise to that challenge, our vision is a network of individuals, institutions, and communities united in the protection of our regional water resources for people and for nature. And towards those goals, our work includes 3 important tasks, which are education, engagement, and advocacy, the first 2, which are critical for the latter. So we keep busy by running community conferences, like the one Grace spoke at just a few weeks ago, as well as timely events related to interests of the community and the watershed. And we maintain an information-rich website and produce newsletters and articles, maintain an active listserv of almost 1,000 people, and share resources with the public on social media. So we also provide and promote volunteer opportunities through watershed-wide programs and work with key organizations like this fabulous HABs program with CSI, and we develop science-backed positions and comments on issues facing our watershed. So while that mission may sound simple, of course the work is not, which is why you'll hear us say again and again that it takes a watershed to a network to protect a watershed. And one of these programs that really emphasizes network action is our Lake Friendly Living program. Lake Friendly Living means making choices at home which promote the health of Cayuga Lake through action to reduce surface water runoff and eliminate pollution. But it's not just you alone taking those steps to protect Cayuga Lake, because the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network is a founding member of the Lake Friendly Living Coalition of the Finger Lakes. And the coalition is made up of lake and watershed organizations working collectively to increase awareness and strategies to protect our lakes. So as a member of the Lake Friendly Living Coalition, we've just wrapped up our 3rd annual Lake Friendly Living Awareness Month, which was in May. And you can learn more about the events that happened across our region by visiting the Finger Lakes Regional Watershed Alliance website here, or simply Googling Finger Lakes Friendly Living, because there's a lot of acronyms to take to keep track of. And we were able to host a talk, which I just want to highlight for you as part of the Lake Friendly Living Awareness Month, which was with Ryan Stashok from Cornell Cooperative Extension, who did a fabulous talk about rain gardens and the approach to establishing rain gardens for runoff reduction at home and within our communities. So that will be uploaded on our YouTube channel soon, and we'll be sharing that widely. So keep an eye out for it. I was totally inspired, and I'm now looking for my own native plants and the right location to do something at home. And through the Lake Friendly Living program, we also have a number of educational resources. We have 3 handbooks. That's the Homeowner's Guide to Lake Friendly Living, Watershed Living in a Changing Climate, and Lakeside Living in a Changing Climate. So there's something for everyone here. Ashley will be working with us this summer to update some of these handbooks to have the latest information about lake friendly living practices, in particular in this changing climate where we're experiencing more intense precipitation and extended droughts throughout the year. And also we're having a lot of fun with the Lake Friendly Living New Year's resolution series. So just each month we've been sharing information about actions folks can take at home. And for June, we have Inspect Your Septic. So if you are off of the municipal sewer system, we just want to remind you that it's really important that you should be frequently inspecting your septic, whether you're a lakeside resident or elsewhere in the watershed. And that there's a lot of resources from the counties on how to do that, including, I know in Tompkins County, they do a series of workshops and provide coupons or like credits for getting your septic inspected. Those go super quick. So if you see those advertised, do jump on that. I think it's a $100 coupon. And then the other counties have similar programs. So we share information about that. So make sure you're staying connected. Of course, in July, we'll be encouraging people to swap out incendiary flares for LED flares because of the pollution that those typical flares cause. So there's just some fun stuff that we're sharing throughout the year. And the heart of the Lake Friendly Living program is taking the pledge. So it's free, and there's so many ways that you can be promoting watershed health at home on any budget. And we know that HABs Harriers are already really active lake and watershed stewards. So even if you're already taking lake friendly living actions at home to improve and protect water quality, you can still take the pledge. Even if you're already on this journey, know that you don't have to do it alone and that you can join and help spread the word. You can take the pledge as a celebration of your commitment to help inspire others. We will send you a fabulous plaque for your front yard if you want to show that off and start a conversation with folks in your neighborhood. And it's things like that that can be used to multiply your positive impact. And of course, then you're joining stewards from across the Finger Lakes region, right, through the work of the Lake Friendly Living Coalition. So together, we're just all in this together. And I want to leave you with some parting thoughts here, that the geology and hydrology and ecology of the Finger Lakes and Cayuga Lake watershed are so incredibly unique and deserving of our appreciation and dedicated stewardship. You know, just the sheer connection between landscape and lake due to the amount of shoreline relative to upland here is really unique. It's very connected, right? So that's just emphasizing how important our actions are. That we are facing these interconnected threats of climate change, land use change, invasive species, and pollution. And there's lots of good work that's being done, and there's so much more that is needed, right? So we really need all hands on deck. And there are stewardship opportunities for everyone, given your background, resources, and your own sphere of influence. So just reflect on that and reach out, to the Watershed Network, to CSI, and we can definitely continue to find the right opportunities for you. Education and engagement are critical steps in effective grassroots advocacy. So that's what we're all leaning into here. And the greatest impact comes from individuals acting and motivating each others to do the same, either through these social networks or programs or policies. So that's what we're here to do, and it takes a network to protect a watershed. So please stay connected with us and keep an eye out for those HABs newsletters. Our website is www.cubalake.org, and we're looking forward to exciting HABs season with you all. Thanks, Grace.
Thanks, Liz.